Well, good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome this evening. Let me just explain a little bit about the plan for the evening. I'm going to speak for 3 or 4 minutes, then I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. He's going to lecture for 3.5 hours. Some of you may remember those days. He's going to talk for about 50 minutes, and then at about 7 o'clock, I'm going to come back and chair a Q&A. We've got microphones. I should warn you, not in any bad sense, but you're being filmed. So we want a record of the evening. So please feel free to ask whatever you wish. And then about 7:30, what we're going to do is to go out into XFI for drinks when you can mix with our illustrious author and tell him where he's got the history wrong. So a very warm welcome. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Steve Smith. I'm Vice-Chancellor of the institution. Really, really pleased to welcome you all here tonight. And I really would like to thank the team who've put on the arrangements for this evening. They've done a fantastic job. And I hope you'll enjoy the evening, because it is, after all, a chance to celebrate a new history of the University of Exeter, the city on the hill, a life of the University of Exeter, written by our very distinguished Exeter historian professor, Jeremy Black. We have a staggering 230 people registered to come for tonight's event. In fact, as you probably know, we had to move the venue. Such, of course, was the interest in what Jeremy has to say, and possibly in what he doesn't have to say. I don't know what you're all expecting him to have dug up about the university's past, but I'm sure he absolutely will not disappoint. I decided, by the way, early on, that this had to be his history. This couldn't be a sanctioned history. This couldn't be a history that we approved or agreed. You can't ask a distinguished historian to write a history and then say, oh, we don't like this bit, can you change that? So I've read an early draft, and I haven't read the final draft, but it will be my bedtime reading from now on. So it's not an official history, it's Jeremy's history of the institution. You're here actually at a fascinating time for the university. We're in a state of significant transformation as the university strengthens its position. It's actually a very interesting moment in the university's history. Now a member of the Russell Group, in the top 10 of all 3 UK league tables. Over 50% of students getting 3 A's or better at A-level in the UK now apply to Exeter, which is a staggering figure. And the next stage for us is the World Top 100. That's our aim, World Top 100. When I arrived 13 years ago, we were 450th. Last year, we'd got to 154th. It takes a long, long time. And if you're by your screens on Wednesday night, we'll all be excited, because at 9 o'clock, the Times Higher, the most authoritative World League table, announces its result for 2015, and we're hopeful of moving upwards. World Top 100 is the goal of the university, and that's what I and the senior team have agreed to deliver. Can I, of course, really thank not just all of you for coming, but really thank Jeremy for taking the time to give this public lecture, and, of course, all the work he undertook for the book itself. I know many of you contributed to that. And can I also thank the people who've worked on the production of the book. It absolutely looks fantastic. It just looks fantastic. It's got pictures, which makes it easier for someone like me to read. Our Honorary Doctor of Laws, Sir Tony Robinson, has just said of the book, and I quote, "This exceptional book will itself surely become a definitive part of the University of Exeter's story," and I'm sure that it will. Indeed, we've been really honoured that Her Majesty the Queen has written the foreword to the book. Such is the prestige of Jeremy's work, and of course the feeling that the Queen has for this institution. So you may be wondering why we chose now to commission a history of the university. Well, over the next 15 months, we'll be celebrating our Diamond Jubilee, 60 years since we were granted our university charter by Her Majesty the Queen on the 21st of December 1955. The university first opened its doors as the University of Exeter on the 1st of January 1956, and an official opening by the Queen took place in May of that year. As those of you who know your history will be aware, we could just as well be celebrating our 160th anniversary, because the origins of the university stretch back to 1855 with the formation of the Exeter School of Art in that year. But commemorating the day we received our charter affords the opportunity to remember what has been achieved and also to look forward to the future. I would like to take this opportunity to thank publicly our former Chair of Council, Russell Seal, and our former Registrar, David Allen, whose idea it was to produce a history of the university. I'd also like to thank Delphine Jones and all the design team here at the university who designed the layout and researched the photography for the book, which I'm sure you'll agree is visually stunning. And in fact, there's lots of photographs in there that have never been seen before. Now it's my great pleasure briefly to introduce Jeremy Black. Jeremy really leads little introduction, an extremely well-known figure here in Exeter, but also nationally and internationally for his acclaimed books and media work. He's a prolific author. When I arrived at Exeter, I got an invitation to a launch of a book, and it was, I think, if I remember, was it his 70th birthday? No, maybe his 50th birthday and his 50th single-authored book. I'd not coloured in that number of books in my career. So this is a very prolific author who's written largely on 18th century Britain, on European and American political, diplomatic and military history. However, he truly is a polymath, having published extensively across a broad range of issues, as well as historical periods. Jeremy graduated with a starred first from Cambridge, followed by a PhD at Oxford. Before coming to Exeter in 1996, he was Professor of History at the University of Durham. He's a member of the prestigious Royal Historical Association, and fascinatingly, and slightly weirdly in my view, he was awarded an MBE in 2000 for services to the design of the Millennium postage stamps. A man who truly has left his stamp on history. So, may I say once again, thank you, Jeremy. Over to you, and I look forward to the presentation and the Q&A later.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't want to give a summary of the book. I hope many of you will read it, and in a way it seems that that is less than satisfactory, given that we have here in this room such a range of the talent that has led and been senior and in fact played all sorts of roles in the university since its foundation. What I want to do instead is to think about, for you, because obviously we're going to follow up with some questions, as to how to actually write a history of the university. I want to discuss with you some of the problems, some of the opportunities that I had, and I want to try. I am a historian. Historians don't own the past, but they have particular approaches to the past, and we have here many of my colleagues, and I want, as possible, to offer an interpretation of what being an academic historian means in the context of a work of this type. But can I just start off with some thanks? It's always rather, in a way, strange. You write a book and your name is the name that appears on the front of the book, the cover, the spine, all over the place. Actually, any book is a collective work. It's a collective work in all sorts of ways. If it's a history book, it's a collective work reflecting your relationship with people in the past, what they did, the sources that they left. It's a collective work reflecting your interaction with other scholars and indeed other commentators, what they have written, what they have thought, the sources they have left. It's a collective work in the sense that the production side of any book reflects very much the way in which lots of people help and contribute, sometimes knowingly so, sometimes not knowingly so. Somebody who tells you, as Steve says, that you're wrong can be just as helpful if they provoke you to think about something as somebody that agrees with you. And this book in particular reflects the way that this university is a community, because so many people gave time to read drafts and to comment on it. Not everybody agreed with things that I said. That's exactly to be expected. I call this, and it's a point I'm going to come to, a life of the University of Exeter, not the life. And I think that's very important. I want to say something about that in a second. But if I might just continue. The fact that so many people had advice on it was extremely helpful to me. It didn't in many senses lead me to do much more than sometimes change particular nuances, because a historian knows that there are differences and divergent views. That's what you expect when you look at the past. As a subject, ours does not have the precision that some other subjects offer. Those subjects, I have to say, often revise their interpretations and their methods, but nevertheless, they at least purport to offer a precision. We don't, particularly in Britain, in a pluralistic society, and particularly actually in the context of a community like this, which is interesting. One of the interesting aspects of it is how very diverse intellectually the university is. And if I may again make mention of the department I've been proud to be a member of since 1996, one of the interesting things for me is that there is no one orthodoxy, there is no one method, there is a commitment to encouraging people at every stage, both staff and students, to develop their potential, which I think is what actually education is about, rather than some sort of grim orthodoxy, which is the method of the department or the method of the institution. And I think that is reflected in the way the university history is presented. Now, I said a life, and that's important. One of the things that distresses, well, distress is too much of a word, that sounds very dramatic. One of the things that disappoints me is the way that so many history books are presented as definitive. There is no such thing as a definitive history book. You cannot do it. You cannot produce a result that provides you with an account that is going to be accepted by everybody or should be accepted by everybody, because the nature of the sources is such that there will always be a matter of informed professional judgment, but that is what it is. It is informed professional judgment. It is not the descent with some form of tablets of stone. I can tell you that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. That is accurate. It would be wrong to say, and it wouldn't be just a matter of opinion, that China bombed it in 1940. But once we move on to discussing the significance of that, the causes and consequences, then there is room for debate and informed disagreement. And so obviously, with a history of a university, or indeed any institution, there is no one way to do it. And I'm going to discuss how I did it, not in order to in any sense seek to derive praise, whether self-praise or praise from others, but simply because I want, in order to help those of you who are going to read it, actually elucidate some of the points that Steve made, that in any book, if you really want to think carefully about the book, think not only about what the author said and the approach they adopted, but why they didn't adopt an alternative approach. And that's linked to the fact that this is, as I say in the book, as it were, part of a broader project. I'm going to deposit, I was very grateful, many people very kindly wrote in and made suggestions about things. They made letters or emails about their views of the university, and will obviously allowing for a period of closure, because some of these remarks might be regarded as confidential. I'm going to deposit, as I said all along, all of the papers in the Research Commons, and I also intend, if anybody has the time or the wish, to write to me and to tell me either why they think it was right or why they think it's wrong. The latter is always more interesting. I intend to deposit those eventually as well, because I think one of the interesting resources, the Research Commons is a very impressive set of holdings, but one of the interesting resources is for us to realise quite what an achievement the major archives of the university are. Now, how did I do it? How did I not do it? What problems does it pose for the historian? Well, firstly, the way I thought about it was that an institution has an internal history and an external history. The two are linked, they interact, but they are necessarily also different. The internal history focuses primarily on those forces, individuals, demands that are autonomous to that institution or independent within it, the pressures for change within. And most university histories, and I did take the trouble to read the others that were out there, and incidentally, if anybody is interested, I think there is one good university history out there, that is Sir James Holt's History of the University of Reading. Interestingly enough, a university slightly older than ours, but essentially from the same period of time. Interestingly enough, Sir James was a very major historian, a very different scholar to myself, an expert on the medieval baronage and their role in Magna Carta. You might say that was particularly appropriate for the kind of professorial-run universities of the age that Sir James was writing about, with King John treated as if he was a kind of weak vice-chancellor. And in other words, it's an inappropriate history for more recent times. But that's really the only one that's worthy of reading, because it's the only one that in a sense actually asks questions of the evidence. Most institutional histories do not do that, which is disappointing. Now, what is the evidence we've got? The two principal parts of evidence for the history of the University of Exeter, and as Steve says, I was writing about the university. There is Clapp's book to deal with the earlier University College of the Southwest and its predecessors. And it is a book that is certainly a good book on those topics. I think it's fair to say that he was writing under a considerable shadow when he was looking at the very last period that he was covering. But as a coverage of the University College, and particularly of Principal Murray's formative development there, it's very good. So what have we got? Well, we've got, since 1955, two essential forms of sources. The written records of the university, now increasingly obviously in electronic form, and also the interviews and verbal accounts and memories, in whatever form they take, of those people who served the university, either as staff, teaching staff, administrative staff, or those who were here as students. And obviously I've used all of those for the history, but they each have opportunities and they have problems, as you would expect in any source. And in particular, there are the issues that arise when you try and join different parts of sources, when you try and join, as it were, the written record, the institutional record, and the record left by people who were, as it were, either there or commenting on what they believed was being the key elements of the time. So let me start with the written record. The university has a very good set of institutional written records. It was very much helped by the fact that for many years they were written by a chap, Reg Erskine, who did the job very conscientiously. I was fortunate to have a very, very, very long interview with him in which he described the way in which he was encouraged to write the records of, for example, Senate of university committees, and the way in which that practice was developed. And what you get as a result is a pretty good account of what the Central University was doing. Now, there are obviously always gaps, and I can talk about some of those, but it's actually a very good account as an institutional record. It's changed somewhat in the 1990s and since, in some respects for the, well, how should one say it, in a different fashion. In the 1990s, the records were less reflective. Ian Powell had much more encouraged a different style of record taking, a much more instrumental style, neither better nor worse, different, and as it were, suiting the fact that the university was getting bigger and therefore requiring, in a sense, a different form of record. In the 2000s and 2000s and teens, the record trace has in a way increased enormously because of electronic access, and also because the university has become much more transparent in releasing all sorts of information, for example, about its finances, are now available and can be looked at on the web in a way that would have been inconceivable in the 1990s, let alone in the days of the first Vice-Chancellor, Sir James Cook. It wasn't that Sir James was in some way sort of trying to keep things secret. He would just have not regarded it at all appropriate for anybody to actually know much about these matters. They were, as it were, a mystery of state. Now, The university archives are very good. What is rather disappointing is the departmental archive side. It's very interesting, this. Departments, including, I have to tell you, my department, or the department I'm fortunate enough to be a member of, have not in any respect kept records that are as comprehensive of their activities as those of the university. And there are good reasons for that. They're obviously extremely busy, but also there's the practical reason that many departments have moved physically. So, for example, history destroyed a lot of its material when it moved from Queen's to Amory, not in some attempt to get rid of the past, but simply the practicality of what do you keep and what do you chuck away. But the result of that, the net result of that is if you look at the archival trace, you very much see a university which is, as it were, from the centre outwards. Records of interviews, of people sending in accounts. The alumni side did a marvellous job by putting out on the web the fact that there was going to be this history and by encouraging former students to write in. And many did. In fact, I see one or two here. Chris Smith, for example, gave a fascinating account of what it was like to be a student doing classics in the late 50s and mice in Gandhi Street and such like. And, you know, but also captured the way that Knight was a thoughtful and really very considerate as well as somewhat eccentric teacher, and really captured the nature of people like Knight and Stubbs and Clayton and that period in a way that's very difficult to do from the archives. I think it's fair to say that the students of the 50s, the 60s and 70s produced a greater amount of material than their descendants. And that, you know, I was wondered about that. I think in part it's because that many people who were students here over the last 20, 30 years don't actually realise they're already part of history. It may seem rather odd to say to somebody in their 20s, 30s or 40s, actually your experience is of interest. It's not just a question of your parents or grandparents that are the sort of people we are interested in. And that in a way reflects, I think, on the way in which heritage is presented on the television and all these programmes about ancestors. They tend to be concerned with pushing backwards into the Victorian period or even further back, as opposed to actually asking quite interesting questions about people over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Anyway, the student's perspective was very, very interesting and, as you would entirely expect, varied. Now that again is important, just as it is a life of the University of Exeter, so the University of Exeter has had many lives. These many lives are not just the different lives of chronology, of buildings, of departments. They are also the different experiences of students and staff in any particular period. And I have my own sort of views as a historian. I've always been very wary of the conceit that a certain age has what our German cousins call a Zeitgeist, a spirit of the age. So that, you know, the idea is that in some way the 1960s is all about whatever you might mean by progressivism or drugs or whatever. Well, that's a view you can take, but the 1960s was just as much a matter of Christian evangelicalism or, you know, Billy Graham sort of revivalist meetings at Olympia as it was about pop concerts. And what one has to do is to be aware that there are many different experiences in any given period. And that in a sense, the great advantage of asking a large number of students and a large number of members of staff for their views is that what you actually get is a diversity and variety which reflects in many ways the fact that this was a rich community, not a rich community in money. The university, I can tell you, was always in a parlous state, and I can tell you from having sat on finance committee for 4 years, that parlous state was certainly very, very evident in the late 90s and early 2000s, and if you go back into the records, you cannot but think what the university would have been able to achieve if it had had more money. It was just for historical reasons, it was founded at a time, the University College of the Southwest was founded at the time of the Geddes Acts just after World War I. when government finances were being cut, it was given a very small allowance as a result. When it became the university in 1955, that allowance was slightly increased but remained small. And the university remained a very poor institution indeed until historic funding went and performance-led indicators enabled, as it were, an attempt to revise the financial settlement of the university as opposed to the financial settlement of other universities. But if we go back to the variety, the point about the variety is that emerges very clearly from the interviews. And so also with the staff. Many of you are people that have given long service to the university, both in terms of administrators and in terms of academics. The whole point about that is that your experience cannot be simplified by running you together in a group. These were 1970s values. That was the 1980s experience. This is what everybody thought in the 90s. Because as you know, if you approach anything closely, that dissolves, that certainty, and in particular, the idea that you can reify it, turn it into a thing, from the Latin for thing, re rerum. So in other words, the idea that you can take 1960s values or 1970s values and turn them into a causative account which explains something else. Doesn't really work. And one of the things that repeatedly I found when I compared and contrasted interviews was the way in which different people, intelligent people, informed people, had very contrasting views of the significance of events or developments within the university. Now, at times this may appear, one can make it, if you like, appear funny, but what it captures is enormous differences. I mean, I saw this in a fairly obvious way with my first 2 interviews. This sounds a terrible thing, but when you're starting a history and you're dealing with people who are alive today, your first anxiety is among those who are going to die. So if you know that somebody is writing a history and they come to see you first, be worried, be worried. Anyway, so for fairly obvious reasons of their significance, I saw the 2 previous vice-chancellors. And you can almost capture the sort of establishment feel of this. So there, Sir David Harrison and myself are having lunch in the Athenaeum, Sir David being very careful to drink out of a tankard, pewter tankard, which he tells me is so much better than drinking out of glass, so something I've learnt. But anyway, Sir David handed on the university. It was an informed, intelligent interview, highly intelligent man, very thoughtful man, been vice-chancellor of 2 universities, knew a lot about universities. So what he said was highly informed and highly intelligent, but the gist of the message was absolutely clear. He had handed on a university in a really effective position, well-run, well-structured, with no significant problems. Sir Geoffrey. Well, Sir Geoffrey, an interesting, rather different interview. Sir Geoffrey came and had lunch in my house, which is always a curiosity if I'm cooking. But anyway, he was very kind to trust himself to some fish, heavily spiced fish that I cooked. Sir Geoffrey, alas, and I sort of, he was not worried about me taking notes. He inherited a university, quote, in a dire situation, 100 years out of date. Student life running at 30 miles an hour, and that was just the start. So the point is to not make a joke about it. Intelligent people will have different perceptions. A scholar knows that. But that is why it can only be a life of the university, and it is why what one has to do is think then in one's assessment how one is going to try and weave a pattern, because you can't simply slap down discontinuous bits of narrative or differing quotations and just say to people, well, it's all a mélange, you pick what you decide. People reading a book do fairly enough expect something other than that. And to me, thinking about it, the key element was how the university responded to and was moulded by the changes in society. and the changes that affected Britain and the world in the period since 1955. Now, we can see some of them just looking at this room. The fact is that now in the university sector, we have a situation in which the ability, the importance, the significance and the effort of women is recognised, very well recognised in this university, with a woman as chair of council, a woman as provost, a woman as chancellor, women as many of the senior administrators. This, of course, is a world away from the university in its early days. The university always had an unusually high percentage of female students. Indeed, many interviewees from the 1950s, males, commented that that was what attracted them to apply to the university, a theme that went on in their recollections through the 60s and into the 70s, and it's remained true. But what is also true, which is much less desirable, and we have to face up to bad aspects of the university's history, is the university did not have a good track record, no more did any other university I have to mention, did not have a good track record for recognising the talent of the women it had, and it could have had. Its track record of appointing women and keeping them on the staff was not marvellous. I mean, I notice Anne Mays is here. I'm delighted to see her. She gave, in one of her letters, a comment about the assumption that once you'd had children, particularly if you had 2 children, the assumption was you would go if you were a member of staff. And if you look at those women who did not have children, but were on the staff, many of them found promotion to be slow or non-existent. So you take a figure like Margaret Hewitt, distinguished sociologist about the position of women. Margaret Hewitt was treated as a sort of university eccentric with her hats and her membership of the Church of the General Synod of the Church of England. She, in fact, was a highly distinguished scholar who should have been promoted. And that was part of a different world. Or Eileen Fox, again, a distinguished scholar. Barlow didn't like her. That was it. Now, in a way, if you now look at the situation since, it reflects the way in which the university has adapted to a differing world. A good thing, our first female professor was in 1973. Many of our recent appointments at all levels have been women. This is part of a broader pattern of engagement, which again reflects the way in which the university is not a sovereign body, nor is it a body whose history should only be written about in terms of what it does itself, but how it relates to the wider world. If you go back to Exeter in 1955, if you wanted to think about its location, you can think about Exeter as an example of what historians call, or those who are interested in the period call, the new Elizabethan age, by which they are referring to Her Majesty the Queen. And it is very interesting, as Steve said, the close links between the Queen and the university. In many respects, what you are talking about is the university as a product of that burst of enthusiasm, optimism that you see in the early 50s, as a country that had suffered enormously in the war, had suffered enormously in the dislocation of the world post-war years, rationing, a country which, you know, had really taken a lot of blows. In the early 50s becomes a more optimistic place. The optimism takes a number of different forms. It takes the forms of a confidence in what Britain can achieve, whether it's good or ill, and you can make your own minds up. Britain becomes, of course, a state with the third state to have the atom bomb. It is still, despite independence for India, it is still the largest empire in the world. You know, the British are climbing Mount Everest. And for those of you who like your cultural icons, you may notice that, of course, in the early James Bond novels, Ian Fleming has a sense of optimism about the situation which is totally missing in the post-Suez novels. Now, the university can be located, and the foundation of the university can be located in that context. The university had a lot of international links in its early years. It then lost many of them, and they were revived in very different forms. Most of the links in the early days were with the empire or the, as it were, informal empire. The university was running courses in public administration, for example, for Nigerians. It was running courses to do with Egypt. It was running courses to do with Iraq. Of course, Egypt before Suez, Iraq before the overthrow of the monarchy in 1958. The Nigerian links really went with the 66-67 coup and the outbreak of the Biafran War. But the university was in some respects an institution located in a sort of quasi-progressive, this is Britain moving forward, education is part of the story, but also in some respects a rather traditional light. It's nothing, the interaction of change and continuity is always the aspect of the historian stock in trade, and you shouldn't be surprised that many of the early staff, as I said, an overwhelmingly masculine group, many of the early staff had served in the war, by which they meant World War II. Some of them had actually been in World War I, but on the whole, Sykes, for example, in economics, had been an anti-aircraft gunner in the Navy in World War I, but most of them were in World War II. Many of them still called themselves by their military ranks. It was sort of, Garland, for example, usually called himself Colonel Garland, Davies of geography, Major Davies, and so on. And there was a kind of sort of among many, but by no means all, having said that there's no zeitgeist, I mustn't allow myself to then bring a zeitgeist in through the back door. There was among many a kind of sub-imperial theme. But also, as I've said, the idea that through education things could get better. One of the things that's very interesting is if you look at the sociological content of the student body in the 50s, in the 50s, the sociological content of the student body is less affluent in terms of parental background. Fewer students are from the children of people in the professional or managerial groups than was to be the case in the 70s or 80s, insofar as the university records are getting it right, and we have no reason to doubt that. So the 1950s gives you a university formed in a certain fashion. It's relating and reflecting the pressures of the outside world and the opportunities of the world, and you can then take those strands forward. If you take the strands of global engagement forward, that global engagement diminishes markedly in the late 50s and 60s. The university records comment on that. The percentage of students from abroad falls. The university's engagement with the outside world decreases. There's always some engagement. And of course, the only major change with that comes after that is the development, very enterprising developments of links with the Arab and Islamic world, which are very important in the sense of actually bringing into the university students and staff of a different range of cultural experience and cultural imagination. And then, of course, as we know, the enormous engagement with globalization over the last 15 years has again brought the university not just benefits in terms of numbers and finances, but also benefits in terms of a more liberal set of cultural assumptions, a set of the way in which we are now much more of a polyglot community, and also so among the staff, which is all to the better. There was a degree of insularity that was commented on by quite a few of my writers. I say mine, they're not mine in any sense, but they were kind enough to write to me. Quite a few of them commented on the insularity of the university when they arrived. And of course that, I don't think anybody in any stretch of the imagination can describe the Exeter of the 21st century as insular. And the way in which the university has ceased to be insular is very important in the way that the town has ceased to be insular. What other aspects can one notice of change? Well, the university as a public body, and sort of as part of that rather curious corporatist character that universities have, they are both private and public, but for many years, of course, universities were astonishingly dependent upon grants from government. And the university suffered very much from that. Not that it was in receipt of government grants, but the actual period when it was founded. Essentially, it was founded with a very low amount of money. In the 1960s, when the money bags opened up, the University Grants Council chose to focus new investment on the new universities of that period. Warwick and Sussex, UEA and Lancaster, Stirling and Kent, and so on. And what that meant, and both the first Vice-Chancellor and the second Vice-Chancellor commented on this very much in documents of the time, was that the university had, as it were, lost out, that it was founded without enough money, and that it had this problem about being a university with too many small departments and an unwillingness or inability to rationalise that inheritance. And of course, if you then look through the 60s and 70s, stopgap financing, both under Conservative and Labour governments, I'm not making any party political point, you know, the funding of universities stopped and started, universities were affected, very badly affected by high rates of inflation, both under Labour in the 70s and under the Conservatives in the early 1980s. Very high rates of inflation hit this university very hard indeed. And of course, the university then ended up in a situation in which adjusting to the cuts became one of the major narratives of the 1970s, the 1980s, and into the 1990s, with often a failure to think strategically about what possibly this ought to entail, whether in fact it was better in response to this to have some form of concentration in some areas. Vice-Chancellors mentioned that idea. David Harrison repeatedly in the records is saying that, but he seems to have been unable to seek to implement or to feel that he could implement the changes that he believed necessary. And one of the aspects of reading the archives is you do see this disjuncture between perception and what people think that they can implement at that period. And then again, in the early 21st century, when you have different opportunities for raising new streams of revenue, in particular through research excellence and through anticipating revenue growth and student growth, you have a very dramatic change on the estate, on the student numbers, and on the hiring of staff. And as it were, many of the issues that people had faced and were absolutely central in the 70s and 80s. Do we actually restructure through losing staff, or do we actually pretend that we're restructuring, but in fact staff continuation, because we can't afford to get rid of anybody, becomes the major issue? These kind of problems are not the central problems of today. And I'm not well, 60 next month, but I went into the university sector when I was 24. I can remember right through the 80s the situation in which, in a sense, university policy was not here, I was at Durham, but was all about trying to save money, a sort of failure to think through what might be the possibilities of moulding change. And one of the ways in which I think universities have been able to adapt is there are more possibilities of moulding change at the moment. Some of those were historically may not last. I was saying, I had some students round on Saturday, and I was trying to think outside the box, and I said to them, well, of course, they were benefiting enormously from interest rates being so low, and that people might look back on this generation of university and think that in many senses the key element was the actual return on capital that you need to derive if interest rates are low, as opposed to if interest rates or inflation are high. And, you know, that, I think, is a way to look at this period. But what I'm trying again to emphasise, and I'm drawing to a close because I know that there are many people would like to make points, but what I'm trying to emphasise is that to look at a history, there is no one way to do it. In terms of the organisation is fundamentally chronological. Why? Well, simply because that avoids the need to repeat long accounts of the financial situation at any one particular moment, and also because chronology does reflect much of the importance of significance in the governance of the university, in its response to outside pressures, in the rise of student numbers, and in other issues relating to all of those and other issues. What does that mean that I don't do? Well, one of the points that was suggested to me was that I organise it in terms of, as it were, accounts by specific departments. I thought that was unsatisfactory. This is not a federation of departments, this university, and in many senses it would not actually be a tremendously helpful way to look at it, and it would also lead me to have to make qualitative judgments about the nature of research, which I'm simply not capable of doing. And there's no point trying as an author to pretend to be omniscient. I'm certainly not omniscient, and as I've said, I don't know any author that is. So what I thought was that the chronology was the way to do it, and in particular to focus on the extent to which the governance and politics of the institution reflected this interaction of outside pressures and differing internal strategies of trying to adjust to it. Now, what is interesting, and again, my historical colleagues will not be surprised to hear this, is that at any one stage, people were able to present themselves as radicals. Most of people didn't like to present themselves as anything other than radicals or progressives. There were some people that presented themselves as conservatives, but on the whole, they presented themselves as progressives in one respect or other. But what is fascinating, of course, is that there were all sorts of ideas, many of which were very good, but not all of which were very practical. And the difference between thinking through blue sky ideas and implementing them is a really crucial issue. One of the ways in which I think the university has changed very much for the better is that the ability to implement policy has improved. And ultimately, however enjoyable it might be to debate matters, ultimately we do actually need, in the end of the day, to fulfill the task which we face. And the task we face, as I said at the beginning, is to help us, the students, the staff, fulfill their potential. I think the university is doing that in a very effective way at the present moment. I've tried in my history to show how different people have also made attempts. Some of those attempts I feel were more successful than others. Some of them at times I think were misconceived, and some of them at the time were considered misconceived by others, which I hope addresses the issue made to be by Roger Burt, that it's ahistorical to criticise people in the past for what they did. I would actually say there were people at the time that criticised, for example, practices in the past that we might regard now as unfortunate or inappropriate or misguided. So what I would like to say is that the university, in its period of time, is an institution which has drawn on the enthusiasm, energy, and effort of a very large number of people. That has produced something that would have been very extraordinary for Sir James Cook to have envisaged when he first, as it were, became the Vice-Chancellor of the new university. Sir James was a man who had a vision. He was the founder of the modern university, and his vision was a good one for the 1950s. But I would like to say, without sounding in any way triumphalist, that I think we have moved on very successfully to a society and a position in the world which is much better for the institution, much better for its students, and much better for the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be disagreements and comments and questions. We've got a couple of roving mics, so if you'd like to put your hand up and just say who you are so Jeremy can identify you. Who'd like to start?
Danger is I talk more if you don't start.
Steve Finley. Steve.
Well, I'm from outside of the university, so maybe that's a good first question. I'm a businessman. I live locally. And I'm very interested in the role of both this university and other universities in in the economy in general and economic development. And I have as somebody who lives nearby, I have a perception of Exeter. Exeter has been singularly very successful in influencing the economy of Exeter. You've only got to walk around the city centre on a Sunday evening now, or a Saturday evening, compared to 20 years ago when I first lived locally. And I wonder to what extent you've talked about the interviews that you have with people who have been closely related and internal to the university. And I guess I'll find out when I read your book, but to what extent have you taken interviews, the temperature of people externally, and what perceptions they have got, which might be similar or different to mine in terms of, it all seemed to change within the scope of the last two Vice-Chancellors. You've mentioned Geoffrey Holland and Steve Latterly, when there seemed to be a sea change in how the university interfaced with the local community and
Right. Okay. First of all, the easy answer is yes, I did interview some people in the community. I interviewed, for example, Mr. Bradshaw, who very helpfully, I think, gave me an hour and a half. I interviewed the bishop. I interviewed a whole host of people. I went to the Met Office. You know, I went and saw as many, as it were, stakeholders as I could do. You know, given that I got things to do as well. There's a whole host of things one can look at in this respect. Let's start. The university suffered initially because the southwest of England was a poor area. And that was a very difficult foundation for the university and helps to explain a lot about its origins and a lot about the problems of launching big science here. In particular, industry. This used to be a great area of wool and textile industry up to the early 19th century, but it collapsed. No coal-based industrialization, and it was really dire. I mean, you know, Exeter had some industries, printing, for example, and can I just say, having mentioned printing, one of the really nice things about this book is that absolutely every aspect of the production of this book took place in Devon. Most of it in Exeter, and the printing of the book is done by Short Run Press. I used to edit Archives. I moved Archives' printing to Short Run Press. It's marvellous to see that there is the range of talent in this community that can actually produce that. But let's go on with your general point. Different Vice-Chancellors and have had differing views about the relationship between the community and the broader purpose of the university. I think it's fair to say that if you look at most universities in the 1950s and 60s, their membership, or much of their membership, was often fairly traditional landed orders. It was normal to have a great aristocrat as the Chancellor. It was normal, I mean, one of the major issues for the university in the 1960s was whether it allowed the hunt or not to go over the university estate. These were the kind of issues that were very important in terms of relationship between, and at that stage, Exeter as a city, I have to tell you, was a rather, how should one put it, not at the forefront of thinking about the world. Let's just put it like that. In the 1960s and 70s, it was Barchester plus a little bit, you know, all right? I think that now, in a way, the university has brought a lot of benefit to the city and the region, but the city and the region also have brought benefits to the university, as has the change of the country, the extension of the 125s. Down in this part of the world in 1976. Very important to locating Exeter in what, you know, it had been, Mike Duffy once said to me when he arrived, it was Sleepy Hollow. Well, when you get the extension of the M5 in the early, I think it's 1973, maybe 75, I'll have to look that up, but I think it's 73. You get the 125s coming here, which is 1976. You have got and also you have a more profound change in Britain in the 1980s and 1990s. That in a way, and a rather undesirable aspect, there's a degree of deindustrialization in the north. The southern economy moves ahead, and Exeter benefits from its greater links into the southern economy. And that helps both the city and the university. Now, what then changes is two very big political issues, and there'll be people here, you've got a lot of talent here in terms of the governance of the university as well as of intellectual life. They will have their views and they may snap at me, which is fine. Under David Harrison, there was an attempt to argue that the university had been not sufficiently bold in its imaging of itself and its presentation of itself. And he frequently argued that the university had to signify more east of Taunton That was one of his major phrases, as did one of his Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Eddie Abel, the chemist. Under Geoffrey Holland, when Geoffrey Holland came in, Geoffrey Holland argued that in practical terms, the university's future was to be a regional powerhouse. Whether his remedies were those, so for example, he wanted to develop the subject of nursing. Whether his remedies would have provided him with that is a matter for debate, and I discuss that in the book. What you then have is a determined engagement with the global scale. So you've had a series of changes in policy terms, and we are now a major player, which has benefited the city enormously. And that's obviously to do with policy and economic opportunity, but it probably wouldn't have been possible to do that in, let us say, 1975. So in a way, there's no point saying Harry Kay didn't think on the world scale. I don't think he could have thought on the world scale. I don't think the university had that ability in 1975. Sorry, I promised to be shorter next time. I'm sorry.
I came down here to build a motorway, so...
Oh, I see. Oh, right.
Next. Who'd like to start? Yes, there's one, right? Yes, hello.
Hello, Elaine M. Goodwin, artist. I have a question that I would love you to answer in a sentence or two. Over the 5 years with reference to Exeter University, what does defining the word university mean when 50 years ago, and how would you define it now?
Well, I would define it by the word potential. I think a university is always a work in progress. And I think that's what education is about, it's what intellectual life is about, it's what leadership is about.
Yes, I understand that, but has there been a difference? Have you noticed slants from in the 50 years?
Yes, I think there was sometimes a more static conception that teaching was not quite designed to be helping people always realise their potential. It was often a more, as it were, sort of declamatory, sort of, sit there and quiet and listen and you'll be told what to do. I don't think that's the modern method of teaching. It's really encouraging to see things like, getting students to do presentations in subject after subject. By the way, as an artist, one of the things I really was delighted about in the illustrations, some of the early illustrations, the first lot I looked at included 3 graduation pictures from physics, and I said, we're not having that. One of the things that I'm really pleased at is the volume picks out the way in which, with artistic excellence, there has been a whole range of works of art across the campus, which are wonderful, as well as the natural environment and the way people like Stephen Scar and the earlier plantings produced what is in effect an architecture of natural aesthetics. And that the pictures do try and capture that.
Next.
Hi, Jeremy. Jeff Myers, local neighbour. Just to say that when you were first approached to do this, did you not think it would be quite difficult as somebody who works for the university to be as objective as you might need to be in terms of producing something that, while it may be something that you intended not to be the university's history of the university, would be perceived by others as being so?
Well, I think that's a very fair question, and in fact, I remember I was asked by somebody straight off, is this going to be a hagiography? I think, first of all, the actual terms of setting it up were entirely appropriate. I was told I would be able to say what I wanted. That actually has been followed through. I said that I would not derive any financial benefit from it, so I don't take any of the royalties. The cost of the product, it's a very lavish book, but the cost of all of that is, and again, I think that's important. I don't think it would have been appropriate as an employee to have taken any financial benefit from it. I'm not an easy or emollient person. You should only need to ask some of my colleagues at the back there. And I think that, in a way, to me, the great problem is not that I'm trying to write an effective history of an institution I work for, because I don't think you could have done it any other way. I don't think you could have got access to policy making and all the rest of it. But the difficulty is how to get it right as far as possible. I mean, you can't be definitive, I've already said that, but you want to get it as right as you can at the time you're writing. So you're trying to reconcile different forms of evidence, you're trying to deal with issues of recovered memory, you're trying to deal with your own prejudices. I mean, I think a fairer question, I think your question's perfectly fair, but a fairer question would be, how do you cope with your prejudices when writing a history of this type? And I think that's a reasonable question to ask. Somebody else might ask me that.
Yes.
Adam Zeman, neurologist. Jeremy, thanks very much. I very much enjoyed your talk. There's always been a tension in universities between research and teaching. And I wondered how that tension has changed over time and how you see it playing out in the future.
That's, again, an excellent question. The ethos of the institution has been research-led teaching. That is easier in some departments than others. Okay? And I would say that it's easier to do that probably in the arts and the social sciences than it is in the physical sciences or medicine. I think that there are practical problems of the scale and volume of finances that you have to provide cutting-edge research in the sciences, which is not the same scale you have to provide in the arts or the social sciences. So in part, I would turn the question round and say, how easy is it for the university to use best practice in some areas when you're trying, obviously, to have similar methods of governance and structure across the whole institution? It's done very well. There was a long problem. When you got external measures, there was a real shock for the institution when external measures came in. Okay, real shock. And it's really interesting interviewing people from that period, because some people, and you look at the archives, some people just said, this is unfair. And I remember, I was on council for a while, I remember sitting on a university panel to review the law department in the late 90s. And the lawyers all came in and told us how brilliant they were. And, and we had experts there from other universities just saying this ain't true. And that mismatch could have been done for department after department. External verification, whether done by the review processes, which essentially were development of the Harrison years, departmental review processes, or whether done, which were then taken on under Holland, or whether done by the RAE, became an enormous shock to large parts of the institution. And you could argue that as a result of that shock, it took a number of years to work its way through, the university more seriously addressed the issue of research-led teaching, and that has become much more effective subsequently. It doesn't mean that the earlier teaching was bad, but it was just in a different context.
Who's next? Yes.
Reinhard Hartmann. Since my retirement a decade and a half ago, I've had a chance to think about relationships between departments, between subjects. And the interdisciplinary links were always, in my period here, very difficult. Language, relations between languages, old languages, new languages, linguistics and literature, linguistics and translation. So I'm wondering whether there has been a change in the last 15 years.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Well, let me just say, first of all, if you look back historically, interdisciplinarity worked best in the social sciences. And actually, as a percentage of students, the university had a very high percentage of interdisciplinary students. Where there was, as you say, a really acute problem is modern languages. It seems that in modern languages, we've got Malcolm Cook here, he may have a different view, but it seems that German for years ran itself as if it was the supreme intellectual force in modern languages. and that French resented that, and Spanish was treated as a poor relation, and Italian as an even poorer relation. And the one thing was that they didn't get on. They really didn't get on. And the problem that came from that was that they never addressed adequately how to maintain a quality teaching environment in a different staff-student ratio, because they spent all the time quarrelling with each other over assets instead of saying we have a common problem here, how are we going to devise new ways of doing it so that we keep the quality element of our teaching but also can engage with greater numbers. So I think you're right about the modern languages, but I think, you would find that there was a whole lot of really quite interesting interdisciplinarity to do with law, for example, interesting interdisciplinarity to do with things like politics. I think there were some quite good, and indeed on the modern languages side, there is still, I was at graduation this year, there was still a reasonable number of people coming forward doing things like history and individual languages, so. But there was something went badly wrong with the governance of the modern languages. It may be that it was one of the last areas of the big barons, the professorial barons, and that they, on the whole, were a malign force in the university.
At least he's not being controversial. Malcolm Cook.
I have to respond to that, Malcolm Cook. I was chair of modern languages for a long time. I just would say that in 1982, I think it was, we were one of the first schools of modern languages in the country. We recognised that Russian in particular was in trouble.
Yes.
And so we did form a group of people, informally, first of all, and then become more formally, to become a school of modern languages, trying to work together and actually having courses that cross the disciplines very early on. I hope that comes out in your history, Jeremy.
I'm sure it does, Malcolm.
Thanks. There's a question right at the back there.
Thank you. Roscoe Hastings, currently working at the university. There's been a lot of discussion tonight about the relationship between the centre and academic departments and between the university and the community. Having not read your book yet, Jeremy, do you make comment about the relationship between the university and the student body as a collective, and potentially between the university and the guild, for instance, and what have you kind of found about kind of students' interactions with the governance and management of the university?
Oh yes, there's a lot on that, and indeed you might, if you wanted to criticise it, say there's too much on that, because, and let me explain that, only a minority of the students were involved in a lot of the student political disputes with the university in the 70s and 80s. If you look at the voting figures, if you look at the numbers who turned out for demonstrations, they were actually really quite small. But nevertheless, they did create a lot of the political dynamics. So one of the those of a certain generation here will know all about the List affair. The List affair owes its origin, of course, it's to the students going into the Vice Chancellor's office, in a sit-in and seizing this document, which was then used to discredit the then Vice Chancellor, or to attempt to discredit the then Vice Chancellor. I think it's fair to say that many students were interested in student politics, but a large number were not. Okay, and I interviewed a certain number of former student guild presidents, and some of them sort of were quite open about this. And of course, when you had the Socialist Workers' Party having, a role, actually as a percentage of the students, it was quite small. That said, the student life is very interesting. Again, it reflects outside pressures, rent rises, reflecting very difficult economic circumstances in the 1970s. It's very interesting to look at the university's struggle to adapt its accommodation to differing student demands, students at some stages wishing to live in and have, as it were, a full-service environment. Then, of course, particularly from the 60s, students wanting self-catering flats, La Frauda, and then you move to the question of the relationship with the students living in the city and the issues that creates, which is a big issue. One of the people in the city I interviewed was was Bostock, and the issue for the city and its and its relationship with granting planning permission or not granting planning permission, and the trying to adjust these relationships. So yeah, that's all there. It's important. And what's interesting, though, is if you do interviews with a lot of students about their student experience of life here, many of them mention things that stem from the Guild activities, things in particular like the big bops. You know, there were lots of the great groups came through here in the 60s and 70s, people like The Who, all sorts of people came through, and the Guild was instrumental in that. They tend never to mention Guild politics. Okay?
Next. Yes.
Sean Curtis, Director of Global Engagement and Development. Jeremy, that was a fabulous lecture, so thank you very much. It's often said that you can view a community through its buildings and the architecture on campus. Over the 50 years, how would you say the architecture of the campuses has changed, and what does that say about us?
Right. Appreciating architecture is very much a personal aesthetic, and different people will have different views. My own view is that the architecture of the university improved from the Peter Chalk building onwards. And the Peter Chalk building was very unusual because it was a building built in order that the people looking outside in should find the building as interesting as the people looking inside out. Okay? The previous buildings of the university, that had not been the proposal. If you look at the previous buildings, you could say that Exeter's great advantage is it rains. And what do I mean by that? I've only just thought of this. What do I mean by that? A lot of Exeter's buildings are kind of Le Corbusier kind of modernist style, which in much of Britain looks absolutely revolting. Think UEA, you know, think all sorts of universities where they are. But the great thing about Exeter is the topography and the trees mean that these buildings often look quite pleasant, or you can photograph them in nice lights. Of the older buildings, the one that was architecturally the biggest problem in design terms was the Basil Spence Physics building. He didn't build the concrete broadly enough. So there's steel, you know, those big things on the outside. There's steel in the centre, concrete round it. The concrete was, he designed it terribly. The concrete wasn't broad enough. What that means is the steel regularly rusts, and the universities had to spend vast sums of money. It would have been better to have knocked it down, but it's a Basil Spence building, you can't do that. The building, the Peter Chalk Centre, was also very good because it fits in with the topography of the, you know, the actual land. I think that kind of flowing and capturing the hill and the trees and the way that terrain flows is brilliantly seen as well with the forum roof and the forum project and the bringing of light into that building. So I think architecture has improved enormously. Student accommodation, I'm not able to comment on. I haven't actually been inside a student hall of residence since I think Mike Duffy, we had a conference in Hope, I think, years ago. So, you know, I have no idea what student bedrooms are like, but, you know, no doubt that, you know, others will have views on the matter. So, you know.
Hi, my name is Malaka. I'm a first year student, PhD. I think, the presentation has been really enlightening, and it's amazing, like for me as a first year student, to know about the history of the university. You've mentioned that the university has some ties with like Arab and Islamic countries around the world. Can you enlighten us a bit about it? Like, how does it start and how does it develop to have like the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, for instance, the reason that I'm here?
Yes, I mean, I've got a fair amount about that in the book. It begins really in the 60s, and from that stage, the engagement with, in particular, the Gulf develops. Initially, the UAE and Dubai are very important. In fact, the university library benefits in finishing from a grant that comes in as a result of that. The teaching develops from two separate strands. One, I mean, we've got Tim Niblock here. One within the Department of Politics, and the other one, as it were, moving outside of politics and becoming a separate centre. And the relationship between those two, at times, was very positive, and at times was a more exciting synergy. But the end result was that under Niblock, what you get is the most successful of what you might call the entrepreneurial developments of the 90s. You see, if you think about the university was fundamentally a departmental set of structures. But there were a series of centres that were put up. Some of the centres were very ephemeral, but some of the centres lasted a long time. Enterprising individuals like Snowden in population studies, Tupman in police studies, created these centres which were actually encouraged by the university as ways to reach out to the broader world and also to derive separate revenue streams which had absolutely nothing to do with taking undergraduates. And interestingly enough, the one, and there's a number of reasons for that, but the one that is most successful is Islamic studies. It essentially comes from an entrepreneurialism that is able to institutionally ground itself, whereas the others found it very difficult to sustain themselves if the head went, or the great originator went. So when Snowden went from population studies, Holland allowed the money to be moved over to the medical side, which was probably a mistake. I mean, not a mistake for the medics, but Exeter was almost unique in the world, having a centre for the serious study of population-related issues, and also for getting a lot of United Nations money for funding family planning, teaching for people from around the world. And it was a really quite important element of it. I think, in fact, on one of the Queen's visits, she went and saw this centre. And the way that that was switched off in the late 90s was really pretty bad indeed. But the Islamic Centre, there was a threat to it in the 90s. And in fact, at that stage, many of the talented people went away. Some went to Durham, Ian Netton went to Leeds. But one of the great successes of the 2000s is bringing back that and grounding it very strongly here. Obviously, the ruler of Sharjah has helped enormously with the funding of the building, but also institutional support has been very, very important. And I think I'm right in saying it's now the largest in Britain, maybe the largest in the Anglosphere. Actually, I think it is the largest in the Anglosphere.
Time for a couple more questions. There's one up here. There, just there.
Thank you. Thanks for Jeremy's brilliant talk. As an international student, I wonder if your book has involved some international perceptions. For example, if you have interviewed some international alumni, and I wonder if the journey of how the university is being internationalized, because I believe the internationalized factor is very important for the development of our university. Thanks.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's not just that it's become internationalized, it's that it's become internationalized at a very high attainment threshold. So in other words, it's not just that the university has been trying for partnerships with foreign universities, and it's not just that it's been trying to recruit foreign students. It's that it's been trying and increasingly succeeding in making sure that its partnerships are at the very highest level with institutions elsewhere, and in particular trying to ensure that there are also research partnerships with institutions elsewhere, so in Beijing, for example, or in Bangalore. And that element, I think, is very important. There was a period, not in this university's history, but there was a period in some universities' history where the idea was just, create a link, sign as many contracts as possible with other universities, grab some foreign students. That's not been the policy here. The policy here has been to try and go for a very high threshold of linkage. And it seems to be working at the moment. I mean, obviously, what it does mean, as I say in my book, is that a modern globalized university is as dependent on interest rates, but also on what happens in internal Chinese politics, as it is the mechanics of what's happening in its own, as it were, backyard. And I think that is that dynamic. I mean, it's interesting from yourself in Exeter and yourself from the Orient. In a way, that's part of a modern globalized world. There is this interaction, and managing that and getting it to work for all the individuals, all the stakeholders concerned is never easy. I mean, that's what leadership at the present moment involves, a much greater geographical amplitude than would have been the case in the past.
I'm very keen to make sure that everyone has a chance. So please, this will be my last call for questions. I'll try and take, if there are any, I'll take as many as there are. Is there anyone who'd like to ask? There's one there. Let me just see if there's any others, because I want to give everyone an opportunity. I can't see anyone else. Okay, our final question.
Pam Latimer, student from 1955.
Congratulations.
Will this lecture and the questions be available on a CD?
Yes, Jane says you can make that happen. So if you ask this lady over here, that's... I mean, can I just say, given that one of the really useful things about this is reaching out to alumni and to make it absolutely clear that the university is interested in its alumni and their views of it, everything possible to encourage that process is something that we want to do. You know, it's very difficult for a modern British university when staff are under a lot of time constraints, both administrative staff and academic staff, but people are interested in this idea that education is something that doesn't just stop when you graduate and links don't just stop when you leave. So yes, if you're interested, I'm sure Jane will provide you with a CD, and if you want to pass on that link to others, that's absolutely great.
Thanks very much. Well, you'll be pleased to know that the lecture and the questions will be on the website as well. For those of you that were so fascinated by it, you want to see your face asking the question again, you're very welcome. I'd just like to say three things. Firstly, obviously, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's a particular pleasure to see so many people in the audience who've been part of the history, and you'll have your views on bits of the book, as I'm sure I will have my views on bits of the book. But the key point is I hope that all of you feel a certain pride in seeing a book of this quality written by an author of this distinction. And I'm really grateful for each and every one of you, not just for coming tonight, but for the many of you who agreed to be interviewed by Jeremy, or wrote things or sent comments in, or will do so after this event. I think his idea of putting the material in the Research Commons is a really good way, so people can be critical about the conclusions that the book comes to. If you see any in my name, they probably are not from me. The second thing I wanted to say was we're now going to go over for drinks in the XFI foyer, just straight through that way and over to the building opposite. But the most important thing, of course, is to thank Jeremy very much indeed for a fascinating talk, but also on behalf of the university for doing us the great honour of writing his version of the life of the University of Exeter. Jeremy, thank you very much.
Thank you.